So, good morning, and thank you for being here so early. I think I should stand here so that everybody can hear me, or am I audible enough?
Your mic isn't on, so why not stand this one?
Yeah, this is the mic for the video presentation. That's the title of my presentation. Sorry, I'll try to stand here. And I like to move around a lot, but I don't think that's handy this morning. And I'll be looking over there every now and then to know what you guys are seeing over here. So if you wonder why is he looking over there, that's the reason. So last week the Dutch Parliament delivered a report to the Dutch government, and many of you, I hope, will have read it. Did anybody here by any chance read it? It's 1, 2, 3 hands, 4 hands, good. So it's a committee that looked at 5 big IT projects run by the government that were a complete mess, and they tried to figure out whether there was something that they could learn from these mistakes so that they could prevent them in the future, and they basically concluded that that's really not very optional. You can't really prevent such mistakes. But they did have a lot of other recommendations, and one of those was that the Dutch government should really take open source much more serious than it has in the past. And so when I read that, I was like, come again? Because this is 10 years after the motion Vendrik, the unanimously adopted Parliament resolutions calling for a transition to open source. And like the slide says, there were a lot of things happened in the past decade. We had an action plan, we had 2 government programs, there were a lot of people running around the country telling municipalities and provinces what to do. And well, we're not there yet. Well, that's what the Parliament says. I'm not sure they did an in-depth analysis of what happens in the Dutch public administrations, and this talk will show you that actually a lot happens on open source and public administrations across the European Union. So here are 2 famous quotes, two big quotes. I find them interesting quotes. One is from Competition Commissioner Kroes when she was still Competition Commissioner, that's 5 years ago. And she's now stepping down as a commissioner, unfortunately. But she said that she knows a smart decision, business decision, when she sees one. And that was a reference to open source and open standards. And the other one is an IT engineer at the Dutch Police Forensics Institute. These guys come in when there's computer fraud or something involving computers, and they need to make sure that everything on those computers can be used in a court session. So that needs to be documented and opened in a legal, sound and valid way. And those guys say, look, we'll only use open source because we need to make sure that the code that we have is the code that we run, that the code that we compile is the code that's on our machines. And it needs to be auditable, it needs to be open, it needs to be on the internet. So I'm going to try and talk in the next 40 minutes, I hope I make that time limit, about some big trends. And I'll give you plenty of examples, but of course first thanks Tido's for having me here and inviting me at this early hour. Thank you very much. Because I live in Waterloo, just under Brussels, so me and my wife left quite early this morning to get here on time, but we did. A little bit about me. I'm a journalist, I'm Dutch, which you already have heard from my accent, so I can do this in Dutch as well. And I was extremely lucky in 2006 to, by coincidence, bump into a project at the European Commission that was looking for a writer, a technical writer, and they were focusing on bringing to light examples of public administrations, governments, provinces, water boards, municipalities, whatever, using free and open source software. The project is called the Open Source Observatory and Repository, abbreviated OSOR. OSOR is written on the slides. And 2 years ago it was migrated to a platform called Joinup. Don't ask me about the name, I don't know who came up with that. So there it's now just one of the sites within a larger site. But I promised you I was going to talk about the big trends. Well, as the slide tells you, since 2007 I've been contacting public administrations across the EU, from Finland to Estonia to Malta to Greece, and they're using open source everywhere. It's really not a question. You can read these quotes for yourself. It's a nice one from the French Gendarmerie. They were invited to the Netherlands in 2009 to the NOIV program. I will come to that story a bit later, but these guys are good examples. And then they disappeared a bit out of the publicity. They just did their work. They wanted to get this thing done. And since a year ago, they are starting to talk more about the success of their project. If you want to meet one of these people, one of the key people, you have to go to Bilbao next month at the Free Software World Conference, and he'll be speaking there. And the other main trend that I see is that there are slowly more politicians that understand free and open source software and that understand open standards in a real way. And that's pretty key. So on the slides behind me and on my right, on your left, the Twitter handles of two young MEPs that just started basically last month, but they're already pretty active. And I suggest you get in touch with them. So before I go on, we've had this report from the Tweede Kamer, the parliament, and they conclude that even though the government has done a lot of talking, it hasn't done a lot of action. And maybe that's true, maybe there are some nuances to be made there. But it really depends on people like you to stand up and to talk to those politicians and say, we want more of this, and you need to do this in your municipalities, you need to do this in your parliament, but you really need to, every now and then, pipe up and just send them an email or send them a letter or call them, and because that's what triggers them to get into action. Again, so here's the big overview. Public sector is using open source everywhere. Document management systems, content management systems, like really not a question. Geographic information system software, really not a problem. That's really well represented. For many of the online e-government services that are being rolled out, once you start digging into the technology, it's running Linux servers, it's running Apache web servers, it's running Nginx web server. They just don't really talk about it anymore, but it's really there. It's across all sectors. Let's start with the European institutions. That's not the focus of the project that I work for, by the way, but it's just, since I'm in Brussels, I see it every now and then, and it's of course interesting because it's a big bureaucracy. But they have their own, the European Parliament, for example, they have their own amendment tool, so it enables members of the European Parliament to change proposals for new laws, and that is written in open source. It's made available as open source. European Commission, that's why this sticker was so interesting. European Commission is itself recommending that we use open standard document formats. That's what it says. It doesn't always do it itself, but it's a big bureaucracy, so there's lots of people, lots of room for mistakes and interpretations. But it's slowly progressing. We should watch the new commissioners, especially the one from Estonia, to see what he will do on this topic. Last year, because the European Commission knows where the wind is coming from, every now and then the Commission organizes these big hiring processes, and they ask for new IT people to sign up and do tests, and if they're suitable they'll get into a reserve list, and if they need a new IT person they'll take it from this reserve list. And one of the questions to the exam was, suppose you had to switch a Directorate General, a ministry, to open source, how would you do this? And 200 people participated in that question, so they now have 200 ways to do that. Railway specifications done in open source. There is a gigantic project to make sure that European citizens can influence the European Commission. Gathering signatures across the EU, you need 1 million. But the whole software stack that organizes that gathering of signatures and making sure that you have it in a legally right way across the countries is done in open source. And it sounds simple, but it's not that simple. Here in the Netherlands, you have to have an ID card with you all the time. So when you, for example, meet somebody on the street, you can prove that it's you. So when you put your signature, they can immediately verify your identity. In England, that's not the case. So this software has to tweak 28 member states' identity rules. It's quite interesting. The project itself is also quite hairy, but it's available under an open source license. European Commission has its own open source license, because they did not really want to go to American court if there ever was a problem with the software that they released under the GPL, for example. Then they would have to fly to the US. We're the European Union, we can do that here. So they basically forked the GPL. And the really interesting bit about the EU PL is that it's available in 21 languages. And all those languages are valid in the EU. So if you're a German software developer, you can use your German EU PL, and then a Dutch software developer or a Maltese software developer can just take the Maltese version and it will be legally the same text. Document management system, procurement software, and the Commission uses GNU Linux, Debian and Red Hat almost everywhere in their service once you start looking at it. That's the European bureaucracy. But once you start calling and looking and going to conferences and talking to people, you see that it's really everywhere. It's in ministries, French ministry, the Finnish ministry. In France, it's really quite big. And thanks to one very active member of parliament, the French ministries have to report every year on how much they're doing it. And so those reports get fed into the French parliament document system, where I take them out, and it's a valuable source of information. It'll just explain, look, we've rolled it out, it was really easy, and it is so much cheaper, we're rolling it out to the rest of the organization, for example. You get quotes like that. The Ministry of Justice in Finland, they did a famous study, well, famous for me, maybe not famous for you, where they compared Microsoft Office, IBM's Notes, I think it was, and Open Office. And they concluded IBM's version was actually the cheapest, but the open source version, Open Office, was the most flexible. And the interesting thing that they discovered is, hey, this license is so permissive that we can roll it out during our test phase. We're still piloting and testing and seeing whether and it just works, and it's all over the organization already, and it's so much faster that we should do it like this. Well, here are the other ministries. I'll share the presentation later. All these yellow links are clickable. They get to the articles that I've written over the past. So ministries, European public administrations, it's in towns, in small towns like Gummersbach in Germany, which recently finished its migration from Windows XP to the Linux Thin terminal client project. And they're really very happy with it. But it's one of those projects that they just did that. They didn't talk about it. Then in the end, the IT guy said, oh yeah, maybe I should tell somebody. And he sent a little paper to Linux magazine in Germany. And then they became world famous because everybody picked it up. And the city of Hamburg is soon, the Greens there, they're in opposition, as there are in many other places. But the Greens are getting a bit tired of the government not changing their IT approach, and so they're looking at Munich and saying what Munich does we should do in Hamburg too. And Hamburg is another very big city. Spanish cities, there's so many examples in Spain. Portugal, this is a very tiny town, but it's interesting because they've been using it for a decade. They didn't go public, they just rolled it out. Whenever they needed something, they would use open source first. And I've been trying to get them to compare the city of Vieira do Minho with other Portuguese municipalities of the same size. That hasn't really worked, but we've done that with this one, the city of Ede, which is now pretty famous because it ended up in the report of the Dutch Parliament from last week. Because here it was for the first time we were able to compare the IT budget and the IT approach of Ede with that of its peers of similar sized municipalities. And Ede is 92% cheaper in software licenses. That's not a small number. So even the parliament was like, huh? Czech Republic, very big town in France, Toulouse. And Arles is a smaller town, but they are very active. People should check them out. This is a really tiny town, Voorep, but there also everything is open source. Pretty big town in Poland, just across the border from Berlin. And there's a lot of cities in Italy that are changing, or have already changed, or have changed their schools and are changing their municipalities. There's a lot going on. It's across all sectors. It's in healthcare. I will not talk about all these links, but if people think, hey, that looks like an interesting one, I should check that out. All these articles are on the OSOR site, on the Joinup site. But you can find, as I said already a few times, examples really everywhere. It's in education. There's an education track upstairs soon. I'm pretty sure that these people will know these examples, because I try to cross-post them in the LinkedIn open source education group. But it's not as well developed as we would maybe like it to be, but there are a few very interesting examples out there. And what is especially heartwarming is that you see IT administrators from schools starting to develop software for their schools with other IT administrators in other schools, even in other countries. And that's quite unique. And here's a great quote from the Westcliff High School for Girls Academy, which you should read. I will not quote it for you, but they advise people to get smart if they want to get ahead in society later on. Ministry of Defenses, the Dutch Ministry of Defense, very active on this. In Poland, it's used a lot. NATO is using ODF. Ministry of Defense in Turkey uses Pardus. It's a Linux distribution. And the Russian government, this is actually kind of interesting. It's a little aside. The Russians looked at, I think, I haven't spoken to them, but they've looked at how their IT infrastructure is becoming dependent on non-Russian software, and they thought that's not a good idea. So Putin at a certain point said, we're going to switch. And 3 days before he made that announcement, 2 of his best friends bought stakes in AT Linux, it's AT Linux. It's a Russian IT service provider specializing in open source. And another friend bought a big stake in Mandriva, a French Linux distribution, because they saw where the wind was going. Well, so I've given you a quick rundown that it's, these days I have to call public administrations and say, are you using open source? And then they say, let me have a look. And then they say, yeah, of course we do. But it's not something that is upfront in their, it's certainly not upfront at the communication department. The IT department will know, but they're not the ones you usually talk to as a press person. But once you get into touch with them, it is not a question. But they don't do press releases about it anymore. 6 years ago, every now and then you would have a ministry that said, yeah, we're doing open source, let's do a press release. And then they did a press release. So that was maybe easier for me, but now it's actually not a question. I can just look and say, let's find a public administration in Bulgaria. It's very hard to reach, but once you reach them, they say, let me look. Yeah, of course, we use Linux service, we have SUSE or Debian or Red Hat, and take it from there. And as I said earlier, there are a rising number of politicians that understand free and open source and open standards, but it is actually, I think, the biggest problem that there are too few of them. And it needs people like you to talk to their politicians, and maybe that sounds strange, but they need to be made aware that this is an important topic, and there's nobody better able to explain that to them than you. So, again, here is a quote from a CEO of the Spanish Basque country, former CEO, because the government changed and he was let go. But he had a few very smart ideas, and the Basque country is rapidly changing all of its IT into open source, because they see that once you change your IT infrastructure into open source, you're actually contributing to society with your donations in code and your donations in bug fixes. Whereas if you keep buying proprietary stuff, you're basically sinking money in a big black hole. And then the second biggest problem, completely known for you guys here, is the desktop. It's very hard to change the login at the desktop. And people have been biting their teeth at this problem and broken their teeth, and people have crippled their careers by trying it. And even at the Commission, this is a big debate. They realize they need to change. They haven't done an official, proper procurement of their desktop software in 20 years. Every time they break their own rules. And every time they feel really bad about it, but they basically don't have much of a choice. But now, this year they promise, this is the last time, next year we will do a proper procurement. We will do all the functional requirements and all the competitors, if there are any competitors, can apply. And yeah, a lot of it has to do with the document format. Hence, then again, interesting sticker. There's a campaign out there called Fix My Documents, which is targeting the European bureaucracy specifically for this problem, for that problem, and where people find documents are made available only in a proprietary format or in a pseudo ISO standard. They can contact the Commission through that site, and the people behind that site will slightly pester and harass the Commission until they improve their ways. The first site that was reported to that project was my site, great, and was luckily also the first site that fixed its behavior. But there, the Commission really wants public administrations to move to open standards. But again, it's a big bureaucracy and a lot of room for interpretation by IT decision makers in the bureaucracy. So it's a bit do as I say, not do as I do. Now, I already mentioned it now, procurement, that's the big third problem. Here are the headlines. It basically works like this. You're not supposed to say you want Microsoft Office. You're not supposed to say you want Oracle. You're not supposed to say you want SAP. But if that's the only thing you want, yeah, you might as well ask for it. But that's not allowed under the procurement rules, and it's about, I think, in 20% of all the procurement cases where they're looking for IT solutions, they just specify brands or products, which is not allowed. People like you and people like me have no position in that debate. We can't. I can ask the public administration, hey, that's not according to the rules. Why are you doing that? And then sometimes they will change their ways. And there are groups like the FSFE that are present here, and colleagues of the FSFE, for example, in Poland, that will methodologically approach all these public administrations, and that will help, because then you'll have the police force saying, oops, and then they take the documents offline and then they change the requirements a bit. But that's something that needs to be done all the time, and that's something that needs to change at all kinds of levels. If you think this is an interesting topic, here are two links. This is Mathieu Pabst, the first must hear. He's doing a talk in Paris, and it's absolutely brilliant because he lambasts the European Commission for making a very interesting route through its own procurement rules and then breaking them. And he explains that it's not, what they do is like not allowed. And he has approached them over that, but they haven't responded. It's easy, right? And then here's a smaller problem, but it is a problem. Public administrations are really unsure of how to do this. I very often encounter a public administrator that says, okay, so then what do I do? And they, for example, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs told the Dutch government, okay, you have this NOIV program. Tell me how to start open source community. Tell me how to engage with open source developers. I don't know. That's not something I've done ever before. And others say, this is something that the Commission struggles with. So open source, how does that, you want me to make my code open source? Okay, I can do that. So then they finish it, and then they give it to my project. Here, it's done. So they have these ready projects, and of course they don't get any traction. Nobody is interested in ready projects. They want to be developed from scratch. They want to be involved from scratch. And you need to build a community by going out there and meeting these people and getting them enthusiastic for your project. So it's hard for public administrations to get there. But I've listed a few examples. There's a nice one in Belgium. Over 200 municipalities in French-speaking Wallonia working together on the Zopi platform, doing basically all their e-government services on Python and Zopi. The French organization for public administrators using open source. It's not governmental, it's just a voluntary organization. It's very active, and it was actually the model for the OSOR where I work. Open Mairie, a very fanatical, well, that's the wrong word, a very active project on open source solutions, specifically for French public administrations. They have a lot of traction. I'm going to run through the some key examples. First, the big ones, the real big ones that you all know, and I can really run through them, and at least I hope you all know them. The French gendarmerie, I have to look at the number, it's 72,000 Ubuntu desktops. That's done, it's finished as of this summer. So when we were driving in France and we see a gendarmerie car chasing somebody who was speeding, it's like you're getting a fine printed through Ubuntu. That's interesting. And the quote from, I can't read that, sorry, getting old. I can tell it to you like this. The guy who went to the NYV conference in 2009, he explained how Ubuntu came to happen at the French gendarmerie, and it's too good to not tell you. One of his colleagues was toying with this at home, and he discovered that, hey, it's OpenOffice or LibreOffice, whatever it was at the time, it works just as well as my proprietary alternative at work, and I can do the same salary calculations or the same pension things that he was doing. So he brought it into work, and somebody from Microsoft heard about this, and he got angry, and he called the general, because it's the gendarmerie, right? It's a military organization. And the general said, I'm getting calls from Microsoft, that's interesting. So he called the guy from Microsoft, and he called the guy from the IT guy that was toying with open source into his office, and the guy said, yeah, well look, it's the same, it does exactly the same, and it works the same, and it's free. Ah, it's free. Well, maybe we should do this on a bigger scale. So that's how they started. And they discovered so many, and they're now ready to talk about it, they've discovered so many advantages. I already mentioned the one in Finland where they say we can roll this out without having to wait for the procurement process of the licenses, and the license management is so much easier. These guys said, France is a big country, they have islands, hundreds of islands, in French Polynesia off the coast of Australia. It's far away. They had a guy that would fly from Paris to Australia and then take a boat and then visit island to island to island to island with his antivirus diskettes, CDs. And when he got back, after a year, they gave him a new stack and he could go again. And now it's no longer a problem. They can do this remote, and it's just less of a headache. And so everybody always asks people, so was it much cheaper? And then the guy says, you know, price is interesting. Of course it's interesting, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. The advantages of being able to implement new solutions or change your infrastructure on the fly, that's really where the profit is. Second big example, the government of Exremadura. I'm not sure people here are aware that Spain is doing so much on open source. They will eventually have 42,000 Ubuntu desktops. They already have 16,000 in healthcare, in all the hospitals and healthcare organizations across the region. And they have, is it there? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, 10,000 PCs in healthcare organizations, 22,000 PCs in the government, eventually, because this is a hairy problem, because it's difficult to get rid of the vendor lock-in, it's difficult to get rid of the applications that require certain proprietary office tools. And interesting, 93,000 schools. That happens a lot in Spain. In schools in Madrid region do this, the schools in Exremadura do this, and there's lots of regions where the schools are actually running dual boots. Happens also in Portugal, by the way. And maybe the most famous, but it's not the biggest example, the city of Munich. And people here are aware that Munich is currently getting some fire from the new mayor. All hands that know this. It's again the same 6 hands, 7 hands. So Munich started to migrate to Linux and other open source tools a decade ago, and it's completely finished. 80% of their desktop systems run a complete open source stack, and 20% runs a mixed stack. And in the server part, the back office it's basically 100%, except for a few last things that they're trying to work on now, the mail, calendar, groupware, that kind of stuff, where they're using Colab, or they will be using Colab. But that was under the previous mayor, Ude, quoted there. They had elections, and there was a new mayor, and the new mayor is a Microsoft fan, and he has an iPhone, and so he started kicking the ball around and irritating everybody and making everybody very nervous. They're not going to I don't know. It might happen because this is where these projects break. If you don't have political support, you can talk what you want. Without political support, the migration will fail. So this is a pivotal moment. It's important to keep an eye on it. It's important to speak out. But the mayor has already done some paperwork on the back of an envelope saying, oh, it's going to be expensive if I want to change this all back. Because A, I'm going to throw away all the years of work that we've had, and I have to buy all new computers, and I have to buy all these new licenses. I don't even know how much that's going to cost. So he might come back on it. But the great thing about Ude was he was a good speaker. He didn't speak English very well. So he would be out there, and then he was once invited to a conference in California. And so he spoke a bit, and then Bill Gates called him. So I hear you're in the neighborhood. Can I drive you to the airport? Yeah, that's of course you can drive me to the airport. So big black van shows up with tinted windows, Bill Gates inside, and I guess a lot of security guards. And Ude steps in, and they drive to the airport. And then Big Hill says, "Why are you making all this trouble? Why are you doing this to me?" And again, Ude doesn't speak a lot of English, so he had to think for a bit, and he said, well, it's right there. Because I want to be free. And then Bill Gates was, free? What do you mean? Free from whom? Free from you, Mr. Gates. And Bill Gates shut up the rest of the 30 minutes on the way to the airport. He also met Bomer, and Bomer was trying to negotiate his way out of this conundrum, because they don't like the Linux project, because it's a sore on their thumb. And so he was offering him free licenses for this and free licenses for that and discounts. And then Ude sat there and said, oh yeah, and what else? And then Bomer went, well, I can add this, and I can do that, and I can add, oh yeah, and what else? Because he didn't speak that much English. At least this is how he said it to the audience where I was. And so he said, and now Bomer thinks I'm a good negotiator. Aside the top three, the famous examples that everybody knows about, and besides, those are all desktop implementations with their difficulties. There are some things that you need to be aware of. I'll make them a bit larger so I can read them. The procurement, hairy topic. In Sweden they have an organization that helps public administrations get procurement out of their to-do list, and they have written a very interesting approach to procuring open source services. It takes care of everything. You don't have to wonder, who am I going to get support for? Because you can choose from these 5 approved supporters. That sounds a bit funny, but that is a group that encompasses almost everybody in Sweden capable of doing open source work, because they have the best single entrepreneur working on it, and they have the largest Linux service provider involved in that procurement. You don't have to worry about making choices, because you can go to these people and they will help you with your IT using open source. And if you, as a municipality, have a bug that you fixed, or you have a module in Drupal, for example, that you want to contribute upstream, these IT people will help you with that. And that makes it a lot easier for public administrations. It's a very, very, very popular approach. It's the fastest growing procurement framework contract in Sweden for years. It hasn't really resulted in public administrations developing code yet, because they're basically using the standard solutions out there, the content management solutions, the document management solutions, and the servers. But give it a bit of time, that might come. Norway is interesting, not only because they're closing down their open source center, I heard that this week, unfortunately, but there's a group of municipalities that started working on developing e-government services, and they're doing that using open source tools, and they have decided to offer these things to all other municipalities in Norway using the internet. So they're moving from having everything local to having everything in the Norwegian cloud. It's interesting for one reason. especially is that since they're moving to the cloud, and it's popular and other municipalities are signing up, these other municipalities might not be aware that they're actually using open source solutions. It's not really visible. And you could wonder if that will take the oomph out of municipalities working with open source communities. It's one of the reasons that people like you should stand up and talk to these municipalities to keep this thing alive and keep them aware. I already mentioned IMIMIO in Belgium, so I can skip that. And I've already touched a little bit on how in France there is really a very big open source culture. You have a government-sponsored Linux distribution. There's a lot of projects from education to ministries. And interesting from a policy perspective is the United Kingdom, where the head of IT is really a pretty smart man, and he realizes that most of the proprietary software tools that are causing a lot of these lock-in problems are by now commodities. And they should be priced as a commodity, and they're not. And he's trying to change that slowly but surely. And one of the big things that they managed to do this summer is to decide that they were going to use the open document format as the internal document standard. It will cause a lot of friction, and it will cause a lot of agonizing, and it will cause a lot of protests from people from all corners. But hopefully they will carry this through. It will be important for the other European countries. Not everything is going smooth. I should also list a few things that go wrong. The German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they had a very nice project to install Debian everywhere. This was also started in a very interesting way. They didn't have much money for IT. They had somebody who knew how to use Debian, who worked at the embassy in Chile, and he said, well, I can do that. You want a secure laptop? Fine, I'll just do encryption for the whole disk, and here it is, there, boom. And other people were impressed, and he was given the go-ahead to roll this out. And so they rolled it out already a decade ago. But then, of course, once they it was all done at the consulates and the embassies, then they had to go to the ministry. And there they were all used to a different working environment, a different desktop. And there the protests started. And then they didn't have the political backing. And then the new CEO didn't like it. And then they had only 1 or 2 people in the ministry that actually knew how to do this. And then they lost it. So they rolled it all back. It's a pity. There are, I already mentioned that Munich is under some fire. Freiburg, which has been really trying to do a lot on open source, LibreOffice, OpenOffice, they had to roll back because of protests from the staff. There was some political support, but not enough. Mannheim, where they also wanted to do this, the CEO now says, sorry, it's going to cost me my career, so I'm not doing it. I'm not going to change my organization against the will of the organization. And therefore I will break procurement laws because I need Microsoft. City of Helsinki, where the city council told the IT department, you will do an open source pilot, and the IT department said no. And it didn't happen. Administrations left and right that ignore procurement rules, I already mentioned that, or ignore their own rules on using open standards. And I briefly touched on this, the Swiss Central Court, they developed over the past decade their own document management system, completely working for their legal instrument. They decided, oh, it's done, we can open source it, and they did. And then a proprietary competitor said, hey, but this is not how it should be, you're doing, this is government-sponsored development work, that's false competition. And they went to court. It's the same court that opened the document system in the first place, but they lost. I mean, the competitor lost because the features weren't. They looked at the features of both systems and they said it's not even the same. It doesn't work. So ours is really different from yours, and they open sourced it. But it was interesting. It's the only case that I know, that I'm aware of, where this happened. The project at the Commission, where there's a few people that really like this topic and are very enthusiastic about it, and they organize studies and reports that bring the topic to a large audience and that try to bring the debate into different policy areas. Here's one of the things that we try to figure out is, are there other reasons than say cheaper or freedom. That free software is a good way to work. And so we did a study on, there was a study on sharing and reuse policies, and compared all the policies in all the 28 member states, and concludes that they all have a policy that they see that sharing and reuse of ICT solutions is a good idea. About half of them actually have laws on this topic. And those laws sometimes list standards, like here in the Netherlands there's a whole list of standards that government should use, public administration should use. Or they have a policy on how to enable other public administrations to reuse solutions that you've developed. Here's some more policy examples, going through the member states a bit. I just mentioned this one. In Italy there is a law that says public administrations must compare proprietary versus open source, and they've been helped by experts on how to compare, because it's difficult to compare solutions. And this is maybe one of the reasons that Italian public administrations are now slowly seeing some kind of light and moving to open source. Spain has a similar law from 2007 that tells public administrations to compare the two. The Basque Country adopted a law that says we will change our entire infrastructure and we will try to share it forward. We will pay our ICT solutions into society. France has the Aero memorandum. It's in French, it's a very well written memo. It's not a guideline, it's not a law, but it's very well written, and it's adopted left and right, that explains why open source and how useful it is in all its facets. Well, in the Netherlands, we have our own activities. I don't think it's entirely hopeless. And at the European Union, the Commission is trying to also change its ways and the ways of the member states. And for example, this is a project that looks at problems in procurement. I'll end this, because then maybe you have some questions. I can't read it, sorry guys. So basically the Commission has done some calculations, also on the back of an envelope, because it's a very difficult topic, but they estimate that they lose $1 billion per year by not using free and open source, by just paying for the same solutions that are used all over the EU by the same administration, and by not donating their IT resources into society, but by bringing it across the Atlantic Ocean or wherever the proprietary vendor has its base, Germany, for example. And I leave you with that, and this is how I did this. Thanks very much.